Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Historian, a quiet corner where the past drifts in softly and forgotten worlds return as gentle stories for the night. Tonight, we'll be wandering into simple ancient Rome, inventions that quietly helped humanity survive, and the long chain of changes they set in motion, from Renaissance beauty rituals to the fall of Constantinople, and even the fragile beginnings of Jamestown across the Atlantic Ocean. These are not loud inventions. They are not dramatic victories. They are the kinds of small, steady ideas that make ordinary life safer, warmer, more predictable, and easier to continue. But before you settle in, if you truly enjoy these calm journeys through history, you're welcome to like this video and subscribe, only if it feels right for you. And when you're ready, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's always a quiet joy to see how many places and moments gather here together. Now, dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum in the background, and let's slowly step into the past, softly, gently, together. You wake before the city is fully awake, though the streets are already holding their shape as if they had never slept at all. The stone beneath your feet is cool, slightly damp from the night air. Somewhere nearby, a fountain has already begun its quiet morning conversation with gravity. Water falls in a steady stream that does not hurry, does not hesitate, and does not surprise anyone. It has been falling like this for years, perhaps for generations. In a Roman city, survival often begins with things that do not change very much. You step onto a narrow street paved with fitted stones, each one placed so carefully that even after decades of carts and sandals, they still hold their line. The street is not sag, it doesn't twist, it does not turn suddenly into mud after rain. It continues forward with a quiet kind of confidence. Long before sunrise, someone has already inspected this road. Roman engineers believed roads should behave like reliable companions. They were layered carefully, beginning with compacted earth, then broken stone, then finer gravel, and finally large fitted paving blocks. Each layer helps the road carry weight downward and outward instead of allowing pressure to gather in one fragile place. It is a small idea, but small ideas repeated across thousands of miles become something larger than roads. They become certain. Ahead of you, the street rises gently toward a bridge. The river below it moves slowly this morning, reflecting the pale sky like a sheet of dull silver. The bridge does not resist the river. Instead, it allows the water to pass easily between its stone supports. The curved arch beneath your feet carries weight outward into the banks on either side, spreading pressure the way clouds spread rain across a valley instead of dropping everything in one place. The Roman arch did not defeat gravity. It persuades gravity to cooperate, and because of that persuasion, bridges like this one could stand for centuries, long after the builders themselves were gone. Nearby, a caretaker is already awake. He walks slowly along the edge of the bridge, pausing once to look down at the present. He is not guarding anything dramatic. He is listening for changes, a shift in sound, a loosened stone, a place where water presses too strongly against the foundation. His work is quiet. Saving humanity sometimes begins with checking for drips. In the distance, carts begin to move along the road that leads toward the forum. Their wheels follow familiar grooves worn into the stone over many years. These grooves are not damaged. They remember. They help guide movement in predictable directions, reducing hesitation and confusion in crowded spaces. Roman cities were designed to behave like dependable mornings. Not surprising, not chaotic, simply ready. As you continue walking, you begin to notice something else. Nothing here feels temporary. The buildings stand close together, their walls supported by repeating arches that distribute weight into neighboring structures. Even if one section weakens, another helps hold it upright. This idea appears again and again across the city. Bridges support traffic, roads support trade. Walls support houses. Aqueducts support water. Each structure quietly supports another. Instead of relying on a single strong point, Rome relied on many steady ones. Engineers today sometimes call this redundancy. But to the people walking these streets, it simply feels like safety. In the writings of the Roman architect Vitruvius, buildings were expected to possess three qualities: strength, usefulness, and beauty. Strength meant surviving storms. Usefulness means serving daily life. Beauty meant helping people feel that the world around them made sense. Oh, when those three qualities worked together, cities became places where uncertainty had fewer hiding places. You pass beneath another archway as the sunlight begins to reach the upper walls. The light moves slowly downward, touching balconies, doorways, and finally the street itself. It feels less like a sudden arrival and more like a careful invitation. Roman infrastructure often behaves like this sunlight: gradual, reliable, predictable, and that predictability allows something remarkable to happen. People began to plan their lives further ahead. Farmers could trust roads to remain open through winter. Merchants could expect bridges to remain standing after floods. Families could depend on water arrival every morning at public fountains. Soldiers could travel quickly when needed. Messages could move across provinces without disappearing along the way. Civilization does not always survive because it becomes stronger. Sometimes it survives because it becomes easier to trust tomorrow. Not far from where you stand, another official is already walking beside a narrow channel of flowing water that enters the city from distant hills. He pauses occasionally to examine the stone edges, watching for cracks or leaks. Nearly 2,000 years ago, a Roman administrator named Frontinus described carefully how these water systems were inspected and protected. Even small losses of water were recorded and repaired. The system did not depend on perfection. It depends on attention. And as the morning brightens around you, the quiet truth of this place becomes clearer. Rome did not remain stable because it avoided problems. It remained stable because it expected them. Soon as the city grows warmer and footsteps multiply across its streets, you begin to notice something even more comforting beneath the stones themselves. Something hidden, patient, and gently carrying warmth where no sunlight can reach. That warmth is already waiting for you under the floors. As the morning light continues to spread across the city, you begin to notice that the sound you heard earlier was not just one fountain. There were many. Water moves through Rome almost the way wind moves through a forest, quietly, continuously, and in ways most people stop noticing after a while. It arrives without argument, it leaves without complaint, and yet it travels an astonishing distance before reaching the place where you now stand. If you follow the sound carefully, it leads you toward a narrow stone channel running along the edge of the street. The water inside it is clear and cold. It doesn't rush. It simply continues forward with patient certainty, guided by gravity alone. Roman aqueducts worked because they did not fight the landscape. They listened to it. Instead of forcing water uphill, engineers designed channels that followed gentle slopes across valleys and ridges. Over long distances, the drop in height might be only a few handspans for every 100 paces. But that was enough. Water does not need persuasion. It only needs direction. Far beyond the city walls, the channel you were watching began as a spring in the hills. From there, it entered a covered conduit of stone, sometimes traveling underground, sometimes crossing valleys on tall arcades of repeating arches. These arcades look dramatic from a distance, but most of the journey happens invisibly, beneath fields and footpaths, where farmers might walk every day without realizing a river is moving quietly beneath them. Near the channel, a water inspector kneels beside the limestone edge and dips his fingers into the flow. He is not testing whether the water exists. He already knows that. He is listening for change. Nearly 2,000 years ago, an administrator named Frontinus wrote about officials like this one. Their task was not simply to build aqueducts, but to care for them constantly. Small cracks were repaired before they expanded. Sediment was cleared before it slowed the current. Unauthorized pipes were removed before they weakened supply to public fountains. Even tiny losses mattered, because in a city this large, a small leak becomes a missing cup of water for thousands of people. You continue walking, and soon the narrow channel disappears into a wider basin at the corner of a public square. The basin fills steadily, then spills gently into another channel that carries excess water away again. Nothing overflows, nothing stagnates. Every movement is planned. Roman engineers expected rainstorms. They expected drought. They expected pipes to fail and channels to clog. So, they built alternatives. Many cities did not rely on a single aqueduct. They rely on several. If one line fails, another continues. If repairs were needed, water still flowed somewhere else. Instead of building one perfect system, they built several dependent ones. Civilization rarely survives because everything works. It survives because something still works when something else stops. At the edge of the square, a small group of residents gathers beside a fountain. They fill clay jars slowly, speaking in low voices as the morning brightens around them. No one rushes. No one worries that the water might disappear before their turn arrives. Predictable water changes the rhythm of daily life. It allows cooking to begin on time. It allows washing to become routine instead of rare. It allows illness to become less mysterious. It allows cities to grow larger than rivers alone could support. Frontinus once recorded that Rome's aqueducts carried more water than many natural rivers. That water traveled across dozens of miles without pumps, without engines, without noise. Only slope, stone, and attention kept it moving. Nearby, a narrow stone plaque marks the boundary of a protected waterline. Roman law treats aqueducts as shared lifelines. Building too close to them was forbidden. Digging near them requires permission. Even planting certain trees nearby could be restricted if roots threatened the channel walls. The water was not private, it was infrastructure, and infrastructure required protection. You walk further along the street until the sound of flowing water becomes softer again, replaced by the quiet drip of overflow channels running beneath the pavement. These channels carry away excess rainwater before it can gather into dangerous pools. They keep foundations dry. They protect roads from erosion. They prevent small storms from becoming large problems. None of this looks impressive at first glance. There are no statues here, no triumphal arches. No inscriptions celebrating victory. Only stone, slope, and movement. Yet the Spanish city of Segovia still carries water across its ancient aqueduct, nearly 2,000 years after its construction. The arches stand in careful balance, each stone pressing gently against its neighbors. No mortar holds them together, only weight and shape keep them steady. Gravity, once again, is not resisted, it is invited to help. You pause beside another fountain where water falls into a shallow basin with a soft, repeating rhythm. Children pass nearby, barely noticing it. A merchant rinses his hands without looking down. A woman adjusts her jar and continues walking home. Reliable systems quickly become invisible. That invisibility is often a sign that they are working well. Somewhere far beyond the city, water is still traveling toward you, along stone-lined paths built by people who expected future generations to depend on their work. They couldn't know your name. They couldn't imagine your footsteps here this morning, but they prepare for you anyway. And as the sound of flowing water begins to fade behind you, another quieter comfort waits ahead inside the buildings themselves. A warmth that rises not from sunlight, but from careful engineering hidden beneath the floor. By the time the streets grow brighter and the sounds of carts begin to echo between buildings, you step inside a house where the air feels different almost immediately. It is warmer here, not drastic warmer, and not in the sudden way of standing beside a fire. Instead, the warmth rises slowly from below, as if the building itself has been reminding yesterday's sunlight and is only now giving it back to you. You pause, noticing the floor beneath your feet. The stone tiles are not cold. In many ancient cities, winter meant carrying warmth from room to room in small clay braziers filled with charcoal. Smoke followed you, ash followed you, sparks sometimes followed you too. But here, the warmth arrives quietly from beneath the surface, without smoke drifting through the doorway, and without the need to watch a flame constantly. This system was called a hypocaust. It worked in a way that feels almost like breathing. Outside the main rooms of the house, a small furnace burned steadily. The fire did not sit inside the living space. Instead, hot air from the furnace traveled through a low chamber beneath the floor, all supported by rows of short brick pillars. As the air moves through these hidden passages, it warms the tiles above it. The warmth then rose gently into the room where people lived, ate, and slept. The floor became part of the fire. You move slowly across the room, noticing how even the walls feel slightly warm to the touch. In larger buildings, hollow clay tubes were sometimes built inside the walls themselves. Warm air passed upward through these narrow spaces, carrying heat from the floor toward the ceiling before leaving through small openings near the roof. The building did not simply contain warmth. It circulated it. Nearby, before the city fully wakes, a bath attendant kneels beside the furnace that powers this system. He feeds another piece of wood into the fire, then pauses for a moment to listen. Then the sound tells him whether the draft is strong enough. Too little air, and the heat weakens. Too much air, and the fire burns too quickly. His work is not dramatic, but entire rooms depend on his attention. Roman bathhouses use this same method on a much larger scale. Public bathing complexes contained warm rooms, hot rooms, and steam rooms arranged in careful sequence. Visitors move slowly from one space to another, allowing their bodies to adjust gradually rather than suddenly. The transition was itself part of the design. Warmth was not treated as a luxury. It was treated as infrastructure. Archaeologists studying these bath complexes have found rows of brick supports beneath entire floors, sometimes stretching across rooms larger than small courtyards. Each pillar lifts the floor just high enough to allow warm air to pass beneath it. The result was a space where heat moved evenly changed of gathering in one corner. Even during colder months, people can gather, talk, exercise, and wash in comfort. Civilization changes when winter becomes less scary indoors. As you continue through the building, your attention shifts toward the windows. They are smaller than modern windows, and the surface of the glass is slightly uneven, bending the morning light into soft ripples that move slowly across the walls. Glass like this was not always common. Earlier houses often relied on shutters, cloth coverings, or thin slices of translucent stone to control light and wind. But Roman glassmakers learned how to produce panels large enough to fit into window frames. The material was not perfectly clear, yet it allowed sunlight to enter while keeping cold air outside. Transparent walls changed the feeling of a room. They allowed light to arrive without inviting the weather with it. The writer Pliny the Elder described Roman glassmaking with careful interest, noting how sand and mineral mixtures could be melted and shaped into useful forms. Workshops near coastal regions specialized in producing the raw glass, which was then transported to cities where craftsmen shaped it into vessels and window panels. It was not perfect glass, but it was enough. Enough to let morning light reach the interior walls. Enough to reduce dampness. Enough to make rooms feel open without making them fragile. You pause beside one of these windows and notice how the warmth from the floor continues to rise slowly around you. Outside, and the air still carries the sharp edge of early morning. Inside, the space remains calm and steady. This difference matters more than it first appears. When buildings protect people from cold winds and sudden temperature changes, illness becomes less common. Sleep becomes easier. Food preparation becomes more reliable. Children grow stronger. Older people remain active longer. Small improvements in comfort quietly become large improvements in survival. The Holocaust did not make headlines in ancient Rome. It did not celebrate victories. It simply made winter shorter inside the house. In some bathhouses, attendants worked through the night to keep furnaces burning so that visitors arriving at dawn would find warm rooms waiting for them. The warmth they created traveled invisibly floors beneath and through walls, reaching people who never saw the fire itself. Comfort arrived without announcement, and as you leave the building and return to the street again, the memory of that hidden warmth stays with you. It follows you past another doorway, another courtyard, another quiet window reflecting the rising sun. Soon, you begin to notice that warmth alone was not enough to hold a vast civilization together. Information also needed to travel, and somewhere nearby, in a quieter room filled with wax tablets and folded pages, another invention was already changing how memory itself moved through the world. As the city continues to wake, you step away from the warmth of tiled rooms and the sound of flowing fountains into a quieter space where another kind of movement is taking place. Here, nothing flows like water, and nothing rises like heat. Instead, information moves slowly across surfaces that can be touched, folded, carried, and reminded. On a wooden table near the window, a young scribe is already at work. He presses a stylus gently into the surface of a wax tablet, forming lines that curve and straighten with practiced care. When he finishes a sentence, he pauses, turns the tablet slightly toward the light, and smooths one uneven edge with the flat back of the stylus before continuing. He is not writing a speech. He is not composing poetry. He is copying instructions. Much of Roman life depends on instructions that could travel. Before the codex became common, most written texts were stored on scrolls. Scrolls may be beautiful and durable, but they were not easy to find. To find a particular passage, you often had to unroll long sections carefully, moving forward and backward until the right place appears. The codex changed that experience in a quiet but lasting way. Instead of rolling text around a single axis, the codex folded sheets together along one edge. Pages could be turned quickly, sections could be marked, references could be found again without unrolling the entire document. Information began to behave differently once it could be opened rather than unwound. Memory became easier to navigate. You notice several codices resting beside the scribe's table. Their covers are simple, made from layered material stiff enough to protect the pages inside. When he finishes copying one section, he lifts another page and continues without shifting his entire position. The motion feels natural, almost effortless. This small improvement changed how laws were stored. It changed how religious writing spread. It changed how merchants tracked accounts and how officials recorded census information across distant provinces. Instead of carrying a long scroll tucked beneath one arm, a traveler could carry now a compact bundle of pages that opened like a door. Some historians believe early Christian communities helped accelerate the spread of the codex because it allowed multiple texts to travel together more easily. A single volume could contain several writings at once, turning small libraries into objects that could fit inside a satchel. The codex did not make people wiser immediately. It makes wisdom easier to carry. Outside the room, voices begin gathering near a public wall where a notice has just been posted. You step closer and see a group of citizens reading together in quiet conversation. The text has been written clearly enough for many people to follow at once. This is part of something called the Acta Diurna. Each day, official announcements appear in public places so that residents could learn about legal decisions, political events, military news, and civic changes. The notices were not hidden inside private archives. They were placed where ordinary people could see them. Information was not always equal in Rome, but it was rarely silent. The Acta Diurna helped create a rhythm in which news arrived regularly rather than unpredictably. Citizens learned to expect updates. They learned where to look for them. They learned how to discuss them with neighbors before returning to work. Oh, reliable information changes how people imagine their future. It allows planning. It allows trust. And sometimes, it allows dissent to remain orderly rather than suddenly. Back inside the writing room, the young scribe finishes one tablet and begins transferring its contents onto a sheet, prepared for binding into a codex. His movements are careful but steady. He knows that what he writes may travel far beyond this building. Roman administrators rely on copied records to maintain stability across distances that stretch from Britain to North Africa and from Spain to the eastern provinces. Lists of taxpayers, census counts of households, supply inventories for armies, and legal rulings for governors all depend on writing that could survive travel. The empire did not depend on memory alone. It depends on memory that can be checked. That wax tablets helped officials make temporary notes that could be erased and rewritten. Parchment allowed longer preservation. Codices allowed entire collections of decisions to remain accessible long after the original writers were gone. Information stopped behaving like a voice that faded after speaking. It began having like a companion that could be consulted again. You reach toward one of the finished codices and notice the faint smell of treated parchment. The surface is smooth, but not completely uniform. Slight variations in texture remind you that each page once belonged to a living animal before being transformed into something that could carry human thought across time. Knowledge often travels quietly. It changes hands without announcement. It waits patiently on shelves while cities grow and change around it. Somewhere beyond this room, couriers are already preparing to carry copies of documents along the same roads you walked earlier this morning. Messages that begin here may arrive days later in another province, still legible, still intact, still. And as those messages continue outward across the empire, they will move faster than memory alone ever could. Soon, you begin to hear the distant rhythm of hooves on stone roads again. A reminder that information travels best when something is already waiting to carry it forward. By the time the voices near the public notice wall began to thin, the roads outside the city are already busy with a different kind of movement. This movement does not belong to merchants or travelers alone. It belongs to messages. If you walk beyond the last cluster of houses and follow the paved road toward the countryside, you soon reach a small station set beside the roadside. It is not large, and it is not decorated. From a distance, it looks almost like a modest farm building. But closer inspection reveals a quiet purpose. Horses stand ready inside the enclosure. They are not resting after long journeys. They are waiting for one. A courier arrives shortly after you do, his cloak carrying a thin layer of pale road dust. He dismounts quickly, speaks only a few words, and hands his satchel to another rider who is already preparing to leave. Within moments, the second rider is gone again, continuing the journey without delay. The message never stops moving. This system was known as the Imperial Courier Network, sometimes called the Cursus Publicus. It allowed official communication to travel across the Roman world, with a rhythm that felt almost like breathing. Riders did not carry messages from beginning to end themselves. Instead, they passed them forward in stages, changing horses at regular intervals so that speed remained steady across long distances. The road you are standing beside is not just a path, it is part of a conversation. Across provinces separated by mountains, rivers, and forests, governors received instructions. Army commanders reported conditions. Supply officials recorded deliveries. Legal decisions traveled abroad from the center and returned again with responses. An empire does not remain stable simply because it builds roads. It remains stable because something moves along them reliably. The courier who handed off his satchel now sits beside a small fire near the station wall. He stretches his hands toward the warmth and closes his eyes for a moment, listening to the fading hoofbeats of the next rider disappearing into the distance. He will rest only briefly before continuing again, with another dispatch traveling in the opposite direction. Speed mattered, but predictability mattered more. Roman administrators often prefer a message that arrived at the expected time over one that arrived unusually fast, but unpredictably. Schedules create confidence. Confidence allows decisions to be made without hesitation. Nearby, a carved milestone stands beside the road. Its surface lists the distance to the nearest city in careful lettering. As travelers passing this marker do not need to guess how far they have come or how far they still have to go. Measurement turns distance into something understood. Standardization turns measurement into something trusted. The same principle shaped Roman coinage. When merchants traded silver coins in distant markets, they did not need to weigh each piece individually. The size, shape, and metal content followed familiar expectations. A coin accepted in one province can be accepted again in another. Trade became quieter when trust became easier. Coins traveled along these same roads, passing from hands in coastal towns to hands in inland villages and back again. They carry more than value. They carried reassurance that agreements made today would still hold tomorrow. Further along the roadside, a small administrative shelter contains wooden tablets covered with numbers arranged in careful rows. These records belong to census officials who traveled through towns counting household, measuring property, and recording names. The census did not exist only to gather information for curiosity. It allowed planning. When administrators know how many people live in a region, they can estimate grain supplies, military recruitment, and taxation needs more accurately. Uncertainty became smaller once numbers replaced guesses. The first Roman emperor, Augustus, organized several empire-wide census efforts to bring distant populations into a shared administrative picture. Each count requires patience. Officials walked from settlement to settlement, now recording details that would later shape decisions made far away from the places where those details were collected. Counting people changed how rulers imagine responsibility. It transformed provinces from distant territories into places with known populations and predictable needs. As the afternoon light begins to soften along the road, another courier approaches from the opposite direction. He slows his horse beside the milestone, checks a small tablet tied to his belt, and then continues forward without hesitation. He does not ask for directions. He does not wonder whether the road continues ahead. The road has already answered those questions for him. Reliable roads allow reliable movement. Reliable movement allows reliable communication. Reliable communication allows large societies to behave as if they are smaller than they really are. Some historians describe the imperial courier system as one of the earliest examples of long-distance administrative coordination at this scale. It did not eliminate delays entirely. Storms still slowed riders, rivers are still flooded, horses are still tired, but the system expected these interruptions. And because interruptions were expected, alternatives were prepared. Fresh horses waited ahead. Stations stand ready at regular intervals. Messages continued moving even when individual riders stopped. The courier beside the fire stands again, brushed dust from his cloak before preparing for his next journey. He lifts the satchel now returned to him and secures it carefully across his shoulder. Inside are instructions written by hands he may never meet, addressed to officials he may never see. Yet his work connects them all. As he mounts his horse and rides forward into the dimming light, you begin to feel that speed alone did not hold this vast network together. Something quieter made it possible. Across thousands of miles, people followed the same measurements, the same building patterns, the same coin sizes, the same administrative habits. Soon, you will begin to notice how repeating the same shapes again and again across an empire can make distant places feel unexpectedly familiar. As the road continues forward beneath the soft glow of late afternoon, you begin to notice something subtle but reassuring about the settlements that appear along your path. They resemble one another, not perfectly, and not in ways that erase their local character, but in ways that make them easier to understand the moment you arrive. The roads meet at familiar angles. The gates open into predictable spaces. The measurements of streets feel almost remembered rather than newly discovered. This acquaintance was not an accident. It was the result of a habit that Rome practiced quietly across centuries: standardization. When Roman engineers built roads, they often followed similars so that carts could pass comfortably in either direction. When they shaped bricks, they produced them in sizes that could be stacked efficiently without constant adjustment. When soldiers established camps, they followed layouts that repeated from province to province, allowing thousands of people to settle for the night in places they had never seen before and still know exactly where everything belonged. Predictability became a form of shelter. You arrive at the edge of one such camp just as the last light begins to settle along the horizon. Rows of tents stand in careful alignment, their entrances facing the same direction, their spacing measured so that movement between them remains easy even after darkness arrives. Fires burn at regular intervals. Storage wagons rest where they are expected to rest. Watch posts stand where they are always placed. Nothing here needs to be explained aloud. The pattern explains itself. A legionary builder kneels beside the corner of a tent and presses a wooden peg deeper into the soil with a short, controlled strike of his hammer. He pauses. Oa checks the tension of the rope and adjusts the angle slightly before standing again. Around him, others perform the same actions in quiet coordination. Even sleep follows a structure here. Roman military camps were designed using consistent internal arrangements that allowed soldiers to find supplies, commanders, and defensive positions without hesitation. Archaeologists studying temporary camps across Europe and the Mediterranean have discovered that many followed nearly identical spatial logic, even when built hundreds of miles apart. A familiar layout reduces uncertainty in unfamiliar places. That reduction matters more than it first appears. When thousands of people can organize themselves quickly after a long day of travel, they remain stronger the next morning. When supplies can be located without confusion, fewer mistakes occur. When defensive walls can be raised in predictable shapes, responses to danger become faster and calmer. Standardization does not eliminate effort. It makes effort easier to repeat. You walk further into the camp and notice stacks of grain sacks arranged in neat rows near a storage wagon. Each sack weighs roughly the same amount. Each is marked with simple symbols indicating origin and destination. The markings allow officials to track movement across long distances without opening every container. Grain was one of the empire's most important lifelines. Cities depend on steady deliveries from agricultural regions far beyond their walls. Ships carry grain across seas, carts carried it along roads, warehouses stored it until distribution was needed. If one route became difficult, another often continued. Yet Rome rarely trusted a single path when several could exist. Instead of building one narrow supply line, administrators developed overlapping networks that supported one another quietly. When storms delayed shipments along one coast, inland routes remained active. When harvests failed in one province, shipments arrived from another. Security grows from repetition. Nearby, a small group of officials checks the weight of several silver coins before recording them in a ledger. The coins match familiar standards used across the empire. Their size and composition allow merchants to accept them with confidence even when they come from distant mints. A shared currency creates shared expectations. It allows strangers to cooperate without lengthy negotiation. It allows trade to continue even when languages differ. It allows agreements made in one town to remain meaningful in another. Standardization does not remove diversity. It creates a framework inside which diversity can travel safely. As the evening deepens, the camp begins to grow quieter. Fires settle into low embers. Voices soften. The builder you noticed earlier finishes securing the last rope and steps back to examine the line of tents stretching into the fading light. He does not need to ask whether the arrangement will work. He already knows. The same pattern worked yesterday. It will work tomorrow. Across the empire, Similar builders performed the same actions night after night, placing the same shapes into the ground with the same expectations. Their work rarely appears in official histories. It did not celebrate victories or describe dramatic events. It simply allows thousands of people to move through unfamiliar landscapes without losing their sense of order. Historians sometimes suggest that this quiet habit of repeating measurements, layouts, and materials may have been one of Rome's most powerful achievements. By reducing small uncertainties again and again, the empire made large distances feel truly smaller than they were. Predictability can travel farther than armies, and as darkness settles gently across the camp and the final hammer strokes fade into stillness, another kind of uncertainty begins to appear in a later century. One that could not be solved with stone roads or measured bricks, but instead with mirrors, powders, fabrics, and the careful shaping of appearances. The room is still dark when you sit down beside the mirror. Then only one candle is burning, and its light moves slowly across the wooden frame as the flame bends slightly in the morning air. Outside the window, the street is not yet filled with voices. Even the birds seem undecided about whether the day has properly begun. In this quiet hour, appearance is not decoration, it is preparation. On the small table beside you rests a shallow container filled with pale powder. Its surface looks smooth and calm, almost like fine dust that has forgotten where it came from. When you lift the lid, a faint mineral scent rises into the candlelight. The powder is made from white lead. It does not promise comfort, it promises clarity. In many Renaissance cities, pale skin suggested that you did not work outdoors beneath the sun. It suggested protection, stability, and belonging to a household where labor happened elsewhere. Complexion became a language that people could read without asking questions. The paler the skin appeared, the safer your position seemed. So each morning, careful layers were applied. You dip a small cloth into the powder and press it gently along your cheek. The motion is slow, deliberate, and practiced. No one rushes this process. The surface must appear even. Shadows must soften. Small marks must disappear. Cosmetics did not simply create beauty, they created reassurance. Marriage alliances in Renaissance Europe often depended on signals that could be observed quickly during visits, ceremonies, and negotiations between families. A composed appearance suggested discipline. Discipline suggested reliability. Reliability suggested a future that might remain stable. And as instability in uncertain times could mean survival. Nearby, another young woman in the household adjusts a ribbon at the edge of her sleeve and glances toward a painted portrait hanging on the wall. The figure in the portrait shares the same calm expression and pale complexion she is trying to achieve. Portraits were not only records of faces, they were instructions. Artists learned to emphasize smooth skin, high foreheads, and steady gazes because these features communicated refinement. Over time, painted images began shaping expectations as strongly as mirrors did. People learned how to look by studying how others had already been painted. The candle flickers slightly as you continue smoothing the powder across your forehead. The effect is subtle at first, then more visible. The surface of your skin reflects light differently now. It appears more even, more deliberate, more composed. White lead powder works slowly, and not always safely. Over long periods, it could irritate the skin and weaken the body beneath the surface. Yet its use continued across generations because the appearance it created carried real social consequences. Elegance sometimes arrived quietly and stayed longer than expected. In a world where inheritance could shift quickly and alliances could change without warning, appearance helped create continuity. It helped families present themselves as steady even when circumstances were uncertain. Outside the dressing room, footsteps pass along the corridor. Servants begin preparing breakfast in the kitchen below. Doors open softly. Fabric moves through narrow stairways. The household is waking. Soon, visitors may arrive, and when they do, They will see what the mirror already knows. They will see a surface carefully prepared to communicate calm. Nearby, a small wooden box rests beside the mirror. Inside it lies a folded cloth used to remove excess powder if needed. Next to it sits a narrow comb and a thin thread used for shaping the hairline at the edge of the forehead. These tools wait patiently, ready for the next stage of preparation. Beauty in this period was rarely accidental. It followed routines that were repeated each morning with the same quiet attention given to lighting a fire or opening a window. In some households, cosmetic recipes were copied into handwritten notebooks and passed between generations. Ingredients were measured carefully, mixed slowly, and stored in small containers designed to protect them from moisture. The process resembled cooking more than decoration. Survival sometimes depended on knowing the correct proportions. As the candle burns lower, its light grows softer, and the powder on your skin begins to settle into place. The transformation is complete not because your face has changed, but because its message has. Where uncertainty once appeared, assurance now stands. Where fatigue once showed, calm replaces it. Where ordinary features once rested, intention now lives. Across Renaissance cities, thousands of similar preparations were unfolding in quiet rooms at the same hour. Mirrors reflected the same careful gestures. Cloth touched the same surfaces. Powder settled in the same thin layers across cheeks and foreheads. No one announced these rituals, yet they shaped how people moved through society every day. Soon, all attention would shift from the stillness of the face to the brightness of the eyes themselves, where another small adjustment could change how vitality was perceived in a single glance. Later in the morning, when the household has fully awakened and the candle beside the mirror has burned down to a soft pool of wax, attention begins to shift from the surface of the skin to something smaller and more expressive: the eyes. In Renaissance cities, eyes were often described as the most persuasive part of the face. They suggested alertness, warmth, and attention. They could signal interest without speech. They could shape first impressions before conversation even began. And sometimes they could be adjusted. On a narrow table near the window rests a small glass container filled with a pale liquid. Its surface looks harmless, almost like clear water, but its purpose is carefully understood by those who use it. The liquid is prepared from a plant called belladonna. Its name means beautiful lady. In small quantities, extracts from this plant could widen the pupils of the eyes, making them appear darker and more luminous. Larger pupils reflected candlelight differently. They created the impression of openness and vitality. In dimly lit rooms, they suggested attentiveness and emotional warmth. Brightness became a language. Across parts of Italy, especially in cities where court life shaped fashion quickly, women sometimes placed a tiny drop of this preparation into their eyes before receiving visitors. The effect lasted only a short time, but during that time, expressions appeared more animated and alive. A servant stands nearby. He's carefully grinding dried plant fragments with a small stone tool. The motion is slow and deliberate. She pauses often, listening for footsteps in the hallway. These preparations were never careless. Too much of the extract could blur vision or cause discomfort. Precision mattered. Long before modern chemistry explained the properties of the belladonna plant, people already understood its visible effects. Physicians recognized that the extract influenced the muscles controlling the opening of the pupil. Cosmetic use developed alongside medical observation, moving quietly between households through handwritten instructions and shared experience. Beauty sometimes traveled through knowledge that was never formally announced. The servant finishes grinding the mixture and places the small container back onto the table. Nearby, a polished metal mirror reflects a narrow beam of daylight entering through the window. The reflection shifts slightly as clouds pass outside, reminding you how much Renaissance interiors depended on small changes in light. Eyes responded to the light more strongly after treatment. In portraits from the period, painters often emphasized wide, reflective eyes as symbols of calm intelligence and gentle attention. Over time, these painted faces helped shape expectations in real rooms. People learned to recognize enlarged pupils as signs of presence and vitality, even when they had been carefully arranged. Appearance became collaboration between art and daily routine. The use of belladonna was never entirely comfortable. The plant itself had long been known for its powerful effects when used in larger amounts. Herbalists handled it carefully. Families stored it securely. Yet its cosmetic use continued because the impression it created could influence social encounters in subtle but meaningful ways. Beauty sometimes blurred the rooms slightly. Those who used the preparation often accepted temporary discomfort in exchange for the advantages it offered during visits, negotiations, and gatherings. A brighter gaze could suggest confidence. Confidence could encourage trust. Trust could shape decisions that extended far beyond a single conversation. In households where preparation followed established routines, mirrors became tools for observation rather than decoration. People studied how light moved across their faces, how shadows gathered beneath their eyes, and how expression changed with posture and attention. Nothing happened quickly. Every adjustment followed practice. Nearby, another container rests beside the mirror. This one holds a small cloth, used to cool the eyes afterward if irritation appeared. The presence of the cloth suggests that users understood both the benefits and the risks of their preparation. Cosmetic knowledge rarely ignored consequences entirely. It simply balanced them differently. Across Renaissance Europe, similar quiet rituals unfolded each morning. Windows opened to admit better light. Mirrors angled carefully toward it. Servants prepared small mixtures. Visitors arrived later in the day and saw only the finished effect. They rarely saw the preparation behind it. Yet the impression remained powerful. Eyes shaped how people listened to one another. They shaped how trust developed across families. They shaped how portraits were remembered after visits ended. Even small adjustments influenced how stories about individuals traveled through neighborhoods and courts. The mirror now reflects your face differently than it did earlier in the morning. The pale surface prepared before sunrise still softens the light along your cheeks. The brightness of your eyes draws attention toward expression rather than detail. Together, these changes create a message that others can read without explanation. Across the dressing table, another set of tools waits quietly for later use. Thin threads, narrow combs, and small scissors designed for shaping the line where hair meets forehead. In Renaissance fashion, even the edge of the hairline could change how a face was understood. And with enough patience, that edge could be moved. Later in the day, when sunlight has climbed high enough to reach the upper walls of the house, attention turns once again to the mirror. This time, not to the surface of the skin or the brightness of the eyes, but to the outline of the face itself. In Renaissance Europe, the forehead was often considered a place of elegance. A higher forehead suggested calm intelligence, careful upbringing, and distance from manual labor. Painters emphasized it. Poets described it. Families quietly encouraged it. Over time, what began as an artistic preference became a daily practice, and daily practices have a way of becoming expectations. Near the window, a young woman stands while a thin thread is drawn gently across the edge of her hairline. The movement is careful and patient. Each adjustment is small. Each pause allows the surface of the skin to settle again before the next motion begins. The change is almost invisible from moment to moment, but over weeks, the outline of the face shifts. Hairline shaping required attention rather than speed. It was not done in a single morning. It was repeated gradually, often in private, often with the assistance of someone experienced enough to recognize when the effect had reached balance. Balance mattered more than transformation. Portraits from cities such as Florence and Venice show this preference clearly. Smooth foreheads framed by carefully arranged hair became part of the visual language of refinement. When visitors entered a room, they read these signals immediately, even if they did not consciously describe them. Appearance rarely needed explanation. It spoke quietly on its own. There, across the room, a tailor prepares another adjustment that will shape not the face, but the posture of the body itself. He lifts a length of ribbon attached to a structured bodice and draws it gently tighter. The movement is slow. He pauses between each adjustment to allow breathing to remain comfortable. Structured garments like early corsets, often called stays or bodices, did not appear suddenly in Renaissance fashion. They developed gradually as methods for supporting posture and shaping silhouettes became more precise. These garments encouraged an upright stance, steady shoulders, and controlled movement through narrow interior spaces. Posture became part of appearance. Standing straight suggested discipline. Discipline suggested education. Education suggested belonging to a household that valued order and stability. In crowded reception rooms, posture spoke before conversation began. The tailor steps back slightly and observes the effect of his work. The fabric now holds its shape more firmly. The wearer moves carefully, adjusting her balance as she becomes accustomed to the new structure. Movement slows, but elegance increases. Stillness can be a form of communication. Across Europe, clothing did more than protect the body from weather. It marked social position in ways that were understood almost instantly. Governments sometimes reinforced these distinctions through sumptuary laws, which regulated who could wear certain fabrics, colors, or decorations. Silk, velvet, and particular shades of dye were often reserved for specific ranks within society. These rules were not always followed perfectly, but they shaped expectations about what different households should look like. Clothing became a map of belonging. In some cities, inspectors even monitored markets to ensure that restricted materials were not sold to the wrong buyers. The purpose was not only economic control, it was visual clarity. When clothing followed recognizable patterns, social encounters became easier to interpret. Order appeared before words were spoken. You move closer to the window and notice how sunlight now falls across the folds of fabric more evenly than before. The structure of the garment guides how light travels across the body. Shadows gather where they are expected. Lines remain smooth where they should remain smooth. Appearance becomes architecture. The same attention once given to arches and roads in earlier centuries now shapes sleeves, collars, and waistlines. Each adjustment reduces uncertainty about how a person will be seen when entering a room filled with unfamiliar faces. Nearby, the tailor makes one final adjustment to the ribbons and steps aside. The wearer takes a slow breath and turns slightly toward the mirror. The change is subtle, but unmistakable. Her posture now reflects intention rather than habit. Standing still could become a lifelong profession. Across Renaissance households, similar preparations unfolded each morning. Threads moved carefully across hairlines. Bodices tightened gradually. Sleeves settled into place. Mirrors reflected the quiet transformation of ordinary movement into deliberate presentation. None of these changes required public announcement, yet together they shaped how families formed alliances, how marriages were arranged, and how trust developed between households that might meet only a few times each year. In rooms where appearance carried meaning, even small adjustments could travel far. Soon, attention would turn once again to something less visible but equally important, the air itself, and the belief that scent could protect the body from dangers no one could see. As the afternoon light begins to soften and narrow, streets fill with movement again. Attention shifts from mirrors and ribbons to something less visible, but no less important, the air itself. In Renaissance Europe, people did not always believe illness traveled through contact alone. Many physicians and households followed an older idea known as the theory of miasma. According to this belief, sickness moved through corrupted or unpleasant air. Its strong smells suggested danger. Clean, fragrant air suggested protection. So, scent became a form of defense. Near the doorway of a quiet house, A merchant pauses before stepping outside. He opens a small carved wooden box and lifts a cloth lightly scented with perfume. The fragrance is warm and slightly sweet, with hints of spice and something deeper that lingers longer than expected. He presses the cloth gently against his sleeve and collar before closing the lid again. The preparation takes only a moment, but the intention behind it is careful. Perfume in this period was not only decoration. It was carried through streets, worn in crowded rooms, and stored in small containers that could be opened whenever the air seemed uncertain. People believed fragrance could balance the invisible qualities of their surroundings, making the environment safer to breathe. Protection sometimes arrived as scent rather than medicine. Some perfumes included rare ingredients such as ambergris, a wax-like substance formed in the ocean and valued for its ability to hold fragrance over long periods. Others used civet, derived from a small animal whose musk could be blended into oils that lasted through hours of travel and conversation. These materials moved across long trade routes before reaching European cities, where they were transformed into liquids stored in glass bottles or carved containers. The fragrance you notice now has traveled farther than the person wearing it. Across markets and ports, merchants exchange scents alongside spices, silk, and metal goods. Perfume became part of the same network that carried information and textiles between distant regions. It connected households to places they might never see. Even air could be traded. As you walk along the street, you notice another detail resting beside the collar of a passerby's garment. A small, dark patch of fabric has been placed carefully on the cheek, just below the eye. At first glance, it appears decorative, and often it was. But sometimes these patches served another purpose. They concealed marks left by illness. Diseases such as smallpox could leave visible scars on the skin long after recovery. Beauty patches allowed wearers to soften these reminders, restoring the smooth appearance expected in formal settings. The patches were shaped deliberately, circles, stars, or small geometric forms, and placed where they balanced the lines of the face. Decoration and protection often worked together. Nearby, another figure adjusts a small container of red cosmetic powder before stepping into a brighter section of the street. A touch of color is applied carefully along the cheeks. The change is subtle, but noticeable. The skin now appears warmer, healthier, more awake. Rouge did not change the body itself. It changed how health was perceived. In crowded cities where illness could spread quickly and unpredictably, visible signs of vitality reassured neighbors and visitors alike. A calm expression combined with warm color suggested strength rather than weakness. These signals shaped how people approached one another in markets, homes, and meeting halls. Appearance guided trust. In some households, scented materials were carried in small, wearable containers suspended from belts or ribbons. When unpleasant odors drifted through narrow streets or crowded interiors, the containers could be opened briefly to refresh the air around the wearer. These objects were both practical and symbolic. They represented an effort to remain balanced within an uncertain environment. The air could not be controlled completely, but it could be answered. As evening approaches, the merchant you noticed earlier steps into the flow of people moving toward the central square. His clothing carries a faint trace of fragrance that lingers as he walks. Others nearby carry similar scents, each slightly different, each chosen for its particular quality. Together, they create an invisible layer of reassurance moving through the crowd. Across Renaissance cities, these quiet rituals repeated themselves every day. Powder softened the surface of the skin, and eyes reflected candlelight more brightly. Hairlines shifted slowly over time. Structured garments shaped posture. Perfume traveled through streets as a form of protection against unseen dangers. None of these practices promised certainty, but each reduced uncertainty a little. In a world where illness often appeared without warning and medical explanations remained incomplete, small adjustments helped people feel prepared for encounters they could not predict. Comfort sometimes begins with believing the air around you can be improved. As the sky darkens and lamps begin to appear along the edges of the street, attention turns away from individual households and toward a distant city far to the east. A city protected for centuries by walls so strong that many believed they could never fall. And yet, one spring morning, even those walls would begin to change what people believed about safety itself. Long after the mirrors of Renaissance households had dimmed and the scented air of narrow streets settled into evening quiet, attention shifts eastward toward a city whose safety once seemed almost permanent. You arrive there in darkness. The wind moves steadily across an open plain outside the western edge of Constantinople, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and distant seawater. Ahead of you, rising gradually from the ground like a careful arrangement of cliffs, stand the great defensive walls that protected the city for centuries. They do not appear hurried. They do not appear fragile. Instead, they rise in layers. The first wall stands low and broad, forming an outer barrier meant to slow approaching armies. Behind it rises a second wall, taller and thicker, reinforced with towers placed at regular intervals. Between these walls stretches an open space where defenders could move freely, while attackers struggled to cross exposed ground. Together, the walls formed something more than a boundary. They formed confidence. Constructed during the reign of Emperor Theodosius II in the early 5th century, these defenses protected Constantinople from repeated sieges across nearly 1,000 years. Its armies arrived with ladders, siege towers, and battering rams. Storms damaged sections of masonry. Earthquakes weakened towers. Yet repairs followed quickly, and the walls remained standing. Stone can feel permanent when it survives generations. You walk slowly along the top of one section, where a narrow path allows guards to move between towers without leaving their posts. Below you, the land stretches outward toward distant hills, where armies once gathered before attempting approaches that rarely succeeded. Some invaders waited weeks before withdrawing. Others never attempted the assault at all. The walls discourage certainty. A night watch guard stands nearby, resting one hand lightly against the stone surface as he looks toward the dark horizon. His task is not to fight at this moment. It is to listen. The wind carries distant sounds differently depending on the season. Hooves, voices, and metal tools each travel their own way across open ground. Experience teaches him what belongs and what does not. He pauses, then continues walking along the rampart with steady steps. Inside the city, life continues as it has for generations. Markets open each morning, ships enter the harbor, churches fill with voices. Children learn to read beside narrow windows facing the sea. The presence of the walls allows daily routines to remain calm, even when rumors travel across distant borders. Protection shapes imagination. When people believe their city cannot fall easily, they begin planning further into the future. Trade expands, libraries grow, workshops invest time in projects that may take years to complete. Confidence becomes part of architecture itself. Constantinople stood at the meeting point of continents, connecting trade routes that carried silk from Asia, grain from the Black Sea region, and spices from lands far beyond the eastern horizon. Ships entering its harbors brought not only goods, but also news, languages, and ideas. The walls protected more than buildings. They protected movement. For centuries, travelers approaching the city saw its towers rising above the coastline and understood immediately that this place possessed unusual stability. Even when political authority weakened inside the empire, the walls continued to shape expectations outside it. Defense can outlast governments. As the night deepens, torches flicker along the watch path, casting shifting shadows across the stone. Each tower marks a distance carefully measured, so defenders could communicate with one another quickly during emergencies. Signals passed from one position to the next without confusion. Measurement supported vigilance. During earlier sieges, defenders repaired damaged sections of wall overnight, while attackers prepared new approaches beyond the outer field. Generations of builders strengthened weak points again and again, adding layers of stone where earlier layers had suffered. The walls learned from experience, yet even strong walls exist within changing worlds. By the middle of the 15th century, the Byzantine Empire that once governed vast territories had grown smaller and more isolated. Provinces once connected by familiar roads now belonged to new rulers. Trade routes shifted gradually. Political alliances became uncertain. Still, the walls remained. They had survived storms, earthquakes, and centuries of attack. Many residents believed they would survive whatever came next as well. Confidence rested not on hope alone, but on memory. Memory of survival can feel stronger than warning. Far beyond the plain, however, new technologies were beginning to change how armies approached stone defenses. Weapons powered by controlled explosions were growing larger and more precise. Metal projectiles traveled farther than before. The balance between wall and weapon was shifting quietly, even while the towers still stood in silence above the sleeping city. The night watch guard pauses again, turning slightly toward a faint sound carried by the wind from the distance. It is not loud. It does not yet suggest danger, but it is unfamiliar, and sometimes unfamiliar sounds are the first sign that even the strongest walls must learn to face a different kind of morning. Before the sun rises over the plain outside Constantinople, the air already feels different, not colder, not darker, but heavier with expectation. Across the field beyond the western walls, shapes stand where no structures stood before. Long wooden frames support metal cylinders resting quietly on reinforced platforms of earth. Teams of workers move slowly between them, speaking in low voices as they prepare tools and materials for the morning's work. These are cannons. They do not resemble the smaller weapons used in earlier battles. These are larger than wagons, larger than doors, larger even than many of the towers they face. Their surfaces hold the faint, dull shine of cast metal, and their openings point steadily toward the ancient walls that have stood here for centuries. Stone has resisted many things, but stone listens differently to thunder. Nearby, an artillery worker kneels beside one of the great cannons and begins preparing the charge. He moves carefully, or measuring the powder with practiced attention before placing it inside the chamber. Too much pressure could damage the weapon itself. Too little would reduce its force against the wall ahead. Precision shapes power. Gunpowder had existed in earlier centuries, but by the middle of the 15th century, its role in warfare was changing rapidly. Instead of supporting only smaller handheld weapons, it now drove massive artillery capable of striking defensive structures from distances that earlier siege machines could not match. The walls of Constantinople had been designed to resist ladders, rams, and towers. They had not been designed to resist repeated explosions. As dawn begins to lighten the horizon, workers step back from the cannon and signal readiness. A slow silence settles across the field. Even the wind seems to pause. Then the sound arrives. It does not resemble the noise of earlier battles. It is deeper, slower, and heavier, like distant thunder rolling across the ground rather than above it. The earth itself seems to respond. The air moves outward in a sudden wave that reaches the walls moments later. A section of stone trembles, not falling, not yet, but listening. Transporting cannons of this size required patience long before they were fired. Historical accounts describe teams of animals and workers guiding enormous artillery pieces across roads and hills over many days. Wooden rollers supported their movement. Reinforced carts carried their weight. Entire groups traveled alongside them, repairing equipment whenever the journey slowed. Even cannons needed rest days. Their arrival outside Constantinople signaled more than the presence of a new army. It signaled a new relationship between distance and defense. Walls that once stopped attackers at arm's length now faced pressure from far beyond bow range. The change did not happen instantly. Each firing required preparation. Each impact weakened only small portions of masonry. Yet repetition mattered. Stone designed to resist sudden force struggled against steady, returning pressure applied again and again in the same place. Time became part of the weapon. Inside the city, residents heard the sound long before they understood its meaning. At first, it resembled distant storms. Later, as impacts continued, the pattern became clearer. The walls were not collapsing immediately, but they were changing. Confidence shifted slowly. Then the defenders worked through the night, repairing damaged sections with earth, timber, and additional stone. Laborers carried baskets of soil to reinforce weakened areas. Soldiers stood watch along towers that had never before required such constant attention. The walls still stood, but they no longer stood alone. Gunpowder artillery altered more than structures. It altered expectations. Across Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, rulers began reconsidering how cities should be protected. Thicker walls replaced thinner ones. Angled bastions appeared where straight towers once stood. Engineers studied the direction of impact rather than only the height of defenses. Architecture began listening to sound. Back outside the city, the artillery worker prepares another charge. His movements remain steady, all almost quiet despite the scale of the weapon beside him. He knows the rhythm of the process now. Measure, place, step back, signal, wait, then again. The second blast arrives slightly sooner than expected. Stone responds once more. For centuries, the people of Constantinople had trusted their walls because those walls remembered victory after victory. Now they were learning that memory alone could not stop change. A structure built for one kind of threat must eventually learn to face another. Morning spread slowly across the plain, revealing smoke drifting in thin layers between the artillery positions. Birds circle cautiously above the field, uncertain where to land. Workers continue their tasks with patience rather than urgency. The walls still rise above them, but the sound of the day has changed. And sometimes, when the sound of a city changes, the shape of history begins to change with it. Soon, another movement will appear along the shoreline of the Golden Horn, where ships begin traveling in a direction no one inside the city expected them to travel at all. For many nights before the final change arrived, the harbor of the Golden Horn had remained calm. Water moved slowly there, protected by a great chain stretched across its entrance. The chain rested between towers at either shore, rising slightly above the surface and dipping again with the tide. It was heavy enough to prevent hostile ships from entering, and for generations it had done its work quietly and reliably. Inside the harbor, vessels rested safely. Markets continued receiving supplies. Fishermen lowered their nets each morning without fear. The chain was not dramatic, but it was dependable. Dependable things often shape expectations more strongly than walls. Beyond the harbor entrance, however, preparations were already beginning in places where ships did not usually travel. North of the Golden Horn, across slopes covered with grass and scattered trees, workers moved silently through the darkness, carrying ropes, wooden rollers, and heavy planks coated with grease. The materials were arranged carefully along a path that climbed gently over land, before descending again toward the sheltered water behind the harbor chain. Ships waited nearby. They did not belong there. Their hulls rested against earth rather than waves, their ropes stretched across wooden frames instead of masts rising freely in open wind. Yet the preparations around them continued with patient determination. The water was not required for movement that night. As the first ship began to rise slowly along the prepared path, the sound traveled farther than expected. Wood pressed against wood. Ropes tightened. Rollers shifted beneath weight that usually floated rather than rolled. The motion was steady but unfamiliar. It sounded like something learning how to move differently. Inside the city, a long narrow street still dark with early spring night. A monk paused beside his desk as the sound reached the walls of his monastery. He had been copying a manuscript by lamplight, his stylus moving slowly across prepared pages with the careful rhythm he followed every evening. At first he thought the noise belonged to distant wagons. Then he noticed that it did not fade. He set the stylus down and listened again. Outside the monastery window, his torchlight moved along distant ridges where no torches usually appeared. The light shifted in uneven patterns, rising and falling slowly, as if something heavy were being guided across the hillside. He returned to his manuscript and continued writing. Sometimes work continues even when explanation does not arrive immediately. By morning, the first ships had reached the sheltered water of the Golden Horn. One by one, they entered a harbor that defenders believed remained closed. Eyewitness accounts, including the journal of Niccolò Barbaro, described the surprise that followed. From the walls, observers watched vessels appear behind the protective chain, floating where no hostile fleet had stood before. The harbor that had seemed secure now carried unfamiliar silhouettes moving quietly across its surface. Confidence shifted more quickly than stone. Inside the city, defenders adjusted positions along the shoreline, moving soldiers and equipment toward areas that had required less attention before. Commanders reconsidered plans that depended on the harbor remaining protected. Watchers climbed towers more often, scanning waters that had once required only occasional observation. The walls still stood, but the map of safety had changed. Ships that usually followed currents now followed intention instead. Across the slopes north of the harbor, more vessels continued their slow passage along greased tracks. Workers guided each hull with ropes stretched carefully between teams positioned along the route. The movement required patience rather than speed. Each adjustment depended on coordination that could not be rushed. Old wooden rollers turned again and again beneath weight that belonged to water. From the monastery window, the monk now watched the harbor directly. The lamplight beside his manuscript had burned lower during the night, and the room smelled faintly of warm wax and drying ink. He lifted his gaze from the page and studied the unfamiliar shapes gathering along the shoreline. Still, he continued writing. Books sometimes travel farther than armies. The appearance of ships inside the Golden Horn did not immediately decide the outcome of the siege, but it altered how defenders imagined their position. Routes that once seemed protected required new attention. Plans that once felt stable required revision. Psychological distance narrowed. Attackers could now approach from directions that had once been considered unlikely. The harbor no longer formed a quiet boundary between safety and danger. Instead, it became another place where uncertainty moved freely across the water's surface. Across the city, bells sounded at intervals as watch posts reported the change. Citizens gathered along streets leading toward the shoreline, trying to understand what they were seeing. Some spoke quietly, others simply watched. Unexpected movement can feel louder than any explosion. Yet, even as the harbor filled with unfamiliar ships, the city itself did not disappear. Churches still opened their doors at dawn. Bakers still prepared bread. Scribes still copied texts. Children still followed their teachers through narrow corridors beside inner courtyards. Life continued beside the walls. The monk returned once more to his manuscript, dipping his stylus carefully into ink before tracing another line across the page. He did not know where the book would travel in the years ahead. He did not know which hands might carry it across mountains or seas, but he continued writing anyway. Because sometimes the future begins quietly, in rooms where people keep working even as the world outside them changes direction. Morning arrives slowly over the harbor. The water reflects a pale sky that seems almost unchanged from the day before, even though the city itself has entered a new chapter of its long history. Ships still move through the currents, market stalls still open along the quays. Bells no longer ring in quite the same way. Yet voices continue to rise from courtyards and narrow streets, just as they always have. Constantinople did not vanish, or it continued. After the conquest in the year 1453, the city became the capital of a growing Ottoman world and gradually took the name Istanbul. Its churches, markets, workshops, and libraries did not disappear overnight. Instead, they changed hands, changed languages, and slowly adapted to a different administration that intended not to erase the city, but to use it. Empires sometimes inherit libraries. Within months of the conquest, the Orthodox Patriarch was restored to leadership of the Christian community inside the city. This decision helped maintain continuity for residents who remained. Religious life adjusted rather than ending. Neighborhoods reorganized rather than emptying. Trade resumed along familiar streets even as new officials walked them. Continuity often survives inside change. As yet, while life continued inside the city, movement also began outward from it. Along the harbor, bundles of manuscripts wrapped in cloth and tied with cord were carried aboard ships heading west across the Mediterranean. Some of these texts had been copied and preserved for centuries in monasteries and schools. Others were family possessions passed carefully from teacher to student across generations. A scholar stands near the edge of the dock, holding one such bundle against his chest. He does not carry gold. He carries pages. Inside the wrapping are works written in Greek long before his lifetime. Philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and histories copied again and again by careful hands who believed these ideas should travel forward even when cities changed around them. The ship waiting beside him rocks gently with the tide. Its ropes creak against wooden posts as sailors prepare to depart. Around him, other travelers move quietly through the same narrow space between land and sea, each carrying what they believe must not be left behind. Knowledge travels differently than stone. Historians such as Marios Philippides and Walter Haynack have described how Greek-speaking scholars arrived in Italian cities in the decades surrounding the fall of Constantinople, bringing manuscripts that attracted the attention of teachers and students already interested in recovering older classical traditions. In places like Venice, Florence, and Rome, scriptoria and universities welcomed these texts and began copying them again for wider circulation. Old words found new listeners. This movement did not create the Renaissance by itself, but it strengthened currents already flowing through European intellectual life. Greek language study expanded. Classical authors were read more carefully. Libraries reorganized their collections. Teachers revised their lessons to include materials that had been difficult to access before. Ideas crossed water more easily than armies. At the same time, another change unfolded more slowly across distant coasts. Trade routes connecting Europe with parts of Asia had long passed through territories now increasingly influenced by Ottoman authority. Merchants continued traveling along these routes, but access became more complicated and sometimes more expensive. Western European kingdoms began searching for alternative paths toward Eastern markets. Some of those paths led to the sea. The Portuguese and Spanish navigators explored coastlines that earlier generations had only mapped in fragments. Ships followed winds farther south along the shores of Africa. Others crossed unfamiliar stretches of ocean, guided by stars and careful observation. Exploration often begins as a response to interruption. From the harbor where the scholar now stands, none of these distant voyages can yet be seen. The ships preparing to leave Constantinople are smaller, closer to shore, and concerned mainly with reaching Italian ports before autumn storms return. Still, the movement of manuscripts across the Mediterranean forms part of the same larger pattern of adjustment taking place across continents. Routes change, people follow them. The scholar steps carefully onto the deck and finds a place beside other passengers traveling west. He sets his bundle down beside him and rests one hand lightly against the cloth wrapping, as if confirming that the pages remain safe. The harbor begins to widen behind him as the vessel turns slowly toward open water. Sea wind lifts the edge of his sleeve. Gulls circle once, then disappear behind the towers of the city. Ahead lies a coastline he has never seen. Behind him remains a city that continues to live under a different name. The manuscripts he carries will not remain with him forever. They will pass through other hands, enter other rooms, and eventually settle into libraries where students will copy them again, translate them again, and teach from them again. Continuity does not require stillness. It requires movement that remembers where it began. Far beyond the horizon of this voyage, across an ocean that European maps still only partly describe, another settlement will soon appear on the edge of a wide river, surrounded by unfamiliar forests and uncertain water. The people who build it will carry with them habits shaped by centuries of roads, books, trade routes, and careful observation of the world around them. And in that distant place, survival will need to be learned all over again. Long before the settlement looks like a town, it looks like a pause. You arrive not at stone streets or towers, but at a narrow rise beside a wide river whose surface moves in two directions at once. The current flows outward toward the sea, then quietly returns again with the tide, bringing salt water back upstream through channels that seem calm until you taste them. The land here was chosen carefully, and incorrectly. When English ships first entered this stretch of the river in the early 1700s of the century's first decade, what later historians would call the early 17th century, the settlers were searching for safety from enemies who might arrive by sea. Spain remained a powerful presence in nearby waters, and the memory of earlier conflicts shaped every decision. So, the site they selected could be defended, it could be watched, it could be approached only with difficulty from the shoreline, but it could not easily be lived in. The ground beneath your feet is soft in places and uneven in others. Fresh water is difficult to find. Mosquitoes gather in slow-moving air between stands of reeds. During warmer months, the river carries a faint taste that does not fully belong to rainwater or ocean water alone. It carries both. Nearby, a settler kneels beside a shallow well dug only days earlier. He lowers a small wooden cup into the opening and lifts it again slowly, studying the surface of the water as it settles. It looks clear enough at first glance, but when he brings it closer, a faint mineral sharpness rises toward him. Salt has traveled farther inland than expected. Archaeological studies of Jamestown's earliest wells show that tidal changes pushed brackish water upward through the soil, especially during dry seasons when fresh groundwater became scarce. Settlers who depended on these wells often found themselves drinking water that did not fully support health. Strategic locations rarely taste good. At the edge of the clearing, unfinished wooden structures stand in loose rows facing the river. Their walls are thin. Their roofs slope unevenly where construction paused to address more urgent problems. Some shelters lean slightly as the ground beneath them shifts after rain. The settlement is still deciding what it will become. English planners had hoped the river would serve as both protection and transportation route. Ships could arrive with supplies, messages could travel downstream toward the coast. Trade might develop with neighboring communities. The location made sense on maps drawn far away across the Atlantic. Maps rarely include mosquitoes, nor did they include the seasonal changes known well to the indigenous communities already living nearby. The region formed part of a network of villages connected through the leadership of the Powhatan Confederacy, whose members understood how rivers rose and fell through the year, when planting should begin, and where reliable fresh water could be found during drought. Survival here required knowledge that had not traveled on the ships. You walk slowly along the riverbank and notice how the water line shifts almost without warning. The tide lifts the surface just enough to cover exposed roots along the edge of the clearing. Later, it will retreat again, leaving shallow pools behind where insects gather. These changes happen twice each day. Each change matters. Standing near the shore, another settler tests the river itself. dipping his hand briefly beneath the surface before tasting the droplets left on his fingers. His expression does not change, but he does not drink again. Fresh water remains uncertain. Disease followed that uncertainty closely. In warm seasons, and insects carried illnesses unfamiliar to the newcomers. In colder months, hunger weakened bodies already adjusting to a new climate. The settlement's defensive position protected it from some threats while quietly inviting others that could not be seen from the watchposts along the river. Protection and vulnerability arrived together. Wood smoke drifts slowly upward from a cooking fire near the center of the clearing. A small group gathers beside it, dividing supplies that arrived on the last ship weeks earlier. Each portion must last longer than anyone expected when the voyage first ended. Rations become smaller as the days grow longer. Still, the settlement continues. Each morning, tools are lifted again. Trees are cut. Walls are repaired. Paths are cleared between shelters. The work is slow but steady, shaped less by certainty than by persistence. Across the river, forest stretches in every direction beyond sight. The land does not yet feel familiar. Its sounds change with each hour. Birds call at times when no one expects them. Mist gathers over low ground before sunrise and disappears again before midday. Learning the rhythm of a place takes time, and sometimes it requires help from those who already know it well. As evening approaches, the settler beside the well returns once more and lowers his cup carefully into the opening. This time, he drinks without hesitation. The taste is still uncertain, but thirst allows fewer choices than planning once did. Survival often begins with neighbors you did not expect to need. When winter arrives along the river, it does not announce itself loudly. It arrives by subtraction. First the insects disappear. Then the warm mist that once hovered above the marsh retreats into clearer air. The sound of tools striking wood grows slower. Smoke from cooking fires rises straight upward instead of drifting lazily through the clearing. And soon the settlement begins to notice something else missing. Food. Later generations would call this season the starving time. But for those living through it, the experience felt less like a dramatic event and more like a quiet narrowing of choices day by day. Supplies from England failed to arrive when expected. Trade relationships remained uncertain. Hunting produced less than hoped. The river itself offered fewer easy answers once cold weather settled along its banks. Hunger rarely appears all at once. It arrives gradually, like a door closing a little more each morning. Inside one of the wooden shelters near the center of the settlement, a mother kneels beside a small fire that is burned almost entirely to ash. She lifts a clay bowl and tilts it gently, allowing a few remaining grains of corn to gather along one side. Her movements are careful, not because the task is difficult, but because nothing can be wasted now. She divides the handful into two smaller portions. Then she pauses before deciding whether she herself will eat any at all. Corn, sometimes called maize by the settlers, had already begun to change how survival worked along the river. Unlike wheat, which the newcomers expected to grow in familiar ways, corn adapted more easily to the soil and climate of the region. It stored well. It cooked quickly. It could be ground into meal or boiled whole, depending on what was available. Most importantly, it had already supported communities here for generations. Members of the Powhatan Alliance understood where to plant it, when to harvest it, and how to preserve it through winter months when fresh food became scarce. Their agricultural knowledge followed the seasons of this land rather than the expectations carried across the ocean. Survival sometimes depends on learning to eat differently. In records sent back to England by the Virginia Company, colonists described the winter as a time when rations shrank steadily and familiar supplies disappeared entirely. Leather from boots and belts was boiled to soften it enough for chewing. Roots were gathered where they could be found. Some shelters fell silent as illness and weakness spread through the clearing. Boots briefly became menu items. The sentence sounds almost like a joke when spoken gently. But for those who lived through the winter, it described a reality that arrived without warning and remained longer than anyone expected. Outside the shelter, the wind moves through unfinished gaps between wooden boards. It carries the smell of river water and distant forest smoke from places beyond the clearing. Somewhere nearby, another family searches through storage baskets for anything overlooked during earlier divisions of supplies. Even small discoveries matter now. Yet the settlement does not face this season entirely alone. Across the river and through surrounding forests, all communities connected within the Powhatan Confederacy continue to move according to patterns shaped by generations of observation. They understood when fish would return to certain waters, where winter stores could be found, and how travel between villages changed with the cold. Sometimes they shared this knowledge. Sometimes they shared food itself. Exchange between the settlers and indigenous communities did not follow a simple pattern. At times, it involved cooperation. At other moments, it carried tension and uncertainty. But during this winter, corn provided through contact with nearby villages helped sustain people who might otherwise have disappeared entirely from the riverbank clearing. Help often arrives quietly. A small group returns from a journey upriver, carrying woven containers filled with dried corn kernels. The containers are not large, yet their weight changes how the settlement breathes that evening. Fires are rebuilt, pots are set back above them. Conversation returns in low voices that had nearly faded in previous days. Warm food restores more than strength. It restores expectation. Inside the shelter, the mother you noticed earlier now places a few kernels into a wooden mortar and begins grinding them slowly into meal. The rhythm is steady and patient. Each movement produces a soft sound that blends with the crackle of newly lit firewood beside her. The children watch without speaking. They understand what this sound means. Corn exchange networks across the region followed seasonal timing that differed from English agricultural calendars. Learning to depend on those rhythms required adjustment not only of diet, but of imagination. The settlement could no longer assume that survival would arrive according to familiar European cycles of planting and harvest. Instead, it began learning a different calendar. Cold nights continued. Hunger did not disappear at once. But the presence of corn changed the direction of the season. It created enough stability for tools to be lifted again, for shelters to be repaired, and for watch posts along the river to remain occupied rather than abandoned. Sometimes survival depends on a single plant grown in the right place at the right time. As the fire brightens inside the shelter and the first pot begins to steam again, the clearing slowly regains its voice. People step outside to speak with neighbors. Smoke rises in more than one place. Footsteps move between shelters with greater confidence than before. Yes, and in the months that follow, another plant will begin to shape the future of the settlement even more dramatically. Not because it solved hunger, but because it changed what the colony could trade with the wider world. In the months after the hardest winter begins to loosen its grip on the settlement, something new starts appearing along the river banks. At first, the change is easy to overlook. A few cleared patches of soil near the edge of the forest, a handful of unfamiliar plants growing in ordered rows, small fences marking spaces that did not exist the year before. The work looks experimental, almost tentative, as if the land itself is being asked a question rather than commanded to answer one. The plant is tobacco. It does not solve hunger, but it changes direction. Earlier attempts to grow familiar English crops had produced uncertain results. Wheat struggled in the soil. Barley followed uneven seasons. Gardens survived in small patches but rarely expanded far beyond immediate needs. The settlement still depended heavily on adaptation rather than certainty. Tobacco offered something different. It traveled well. When dried carefully and packed into barrels, its leaves survived long ocean crossings without losing value. In distant markets across England and Europe, demand for the plant was already growing. Merchants recognized its scent long before ships reached harbor. Trade began to smell different. One afternoon, inside a narrow wooden curing shed near the edge of the clearing, A planter lifts a bundle of drying leaves and turns them slowly so that air can pass evenly across their surfaces. The leaves are fragile but not weak. They respond to careful handling. Too much moisture and they darken unevenly. Too little and they crack before they can be packed. He works patiently. Curing tobacco requires attention similar to tending a small fire. It must be watched, adjusted, and guided rather than forced. The shed itself smells warm and slightly sweet, with a dryness that settles quietly into clothing and hair. Across the riverbanks surrounding the settlement, more sheds like this begin appearing. Each one marks a decision. Instead of growing only what can be eaten nearby, the colony begins growing something meant to travel far away. Tobacco connects the settlement not only to its immediate environment, but to ships waiting beyond the horizon. Distance becomes useful. A man named John Rolfe is often remembered for helping introduce tobacco varieties that adapted more successfully to English market expectations. Earlier local strains grown by indigenous communities already existed in the region, but Rolfe's experiments created a version more attractive to European buyers. Agriculture began listening to trade winds. Soon, narrow strips of cleared land extended outward from the settlement along the river's edge. Tobacco plants preferred soil that had not been exhausted by repeated planting, so fields moved gradually farther from the center of the original clearing each year. Success required movement. Even fertile soil did not remain fertile forever. After several seasons, tobacco drained nutrients from the ground and encouraged planters to seek new plots. The forest edges retreated slowly as new rows appeared beyond earlier ones. The colony began stretching along the water like a line being drawn carefully through the landscape. Riverbanks mattered because boats could carry heavy barrels more easily than wagons could carry them across forests. Plantations formed where loading docks could be built. Houses followed fields. Paths followed houses. Geography rearranged itself around a plant. Inside the curing shed, the planter lowers another bundle of leaves onto a rack suspended from the ceiling beams. Sunlight passes through narrow gaps in the wooden walls, falling in the thin stripes across the hanging rows. Dust moves slowly through the air each time he shifts position. Outside, voices call from the shoreline, where a small boat has just arrived with supplies. And labor becomes part of this transformation as well. At first, much of the work depended on indentured servants who agreed to several years of labor in exchange for passage across the Atlantic. Contracts described terms lasting 4, 5, sometimes 7 years. During that time, servants planted, harvested, cut timber, and built new structures along expanding river settlements. Work created opportunity, but it also created demand. As tobacco production increased, the need for steady labor grew larger than indentured contracts alone could supply. In the year 1619, a group of Africans arrived in Virginia under circumstances that would later become part of a much larger and more painful system of forced labor across the Atlantic world. The transformation did not happen in a single moment. It unfolded gradually, field by field, season by season. Still, the presence of tobacco ensured that the colony would not remain a small riverside experiment. It became part of a wider economic network linking forests in Virginia to markets across oceans. Ships began arriving more regularly. Exports became predictable. Investors far away began to pay closer attention. Stability sometimes grows from trade rather than soil. Even as the planter continues turning the drying leaves inside the shed, he already knows that the next planting season will require clearing another patch of forest beyond the current fields. The work never remains finished for long. Each harvest suggests another beginning. Even success required constant relocation. Across the river, new docks are already being built, where barrels will soon wait beside the water's edge. Each barrel represents weeks of labor and months of expectation. Each one carries the scent of a settlement, learning how to remain connected to a wider world. And as tobacco reshapes fields and rivers alike, another change begins quietly inside the settlement itself. one that will shape not crops, but voices, and the way decisions are made together. By late summer, the settlement beside the river begins to sound different again. Axes still strike wood along the edges of new fields. Boats still move slowly between plantations. Tobacco leaves still dry in long rows inside wooden sheds. Yet another rhythm has quietly entered daily life. A rhythm made not by tools or crops, but by conversation. It begins inside a wooden church. The building itself is modest. Its walls are simple planks fitted closely together, or its roof angled just enough to keep rain moving away from the entrance. Light enters through narrow openings and settles gently along benches arranged in uneven rows. The space smells faintly of timber warmed by the afternoon sun. Here, a small group gathers. They are not soldiers. They are not merchants preparing cargo. They are men chosen to speak for the settlements scattered along the river. In the year 1619, representatives from several Virginia communities met together in Jamestown to discuss local concerns, laws, and responsibilities. This gathering became known as the House of Burgesses. At the time, no one in the room could know how long its influence would travel. Yet the habit it created began immediately. Inside the church, a clerk bends over a rough wooden table with a quill held carefully between his fingers. He writes slowly, pausing between words to ensure each line remains clear. Ink spreads slightly along the grain of the paper as he records decisions that will guide how the colony organizes land, labor, and trade. Writing turns discussion into memory. The representatives speak quietly with one another before each vote. Their concerns are practical. They discuss planting schedules, relations with neighboring communities, defense arrangements, and the distribution of supplies. None of these topics feels grand in the moment, but repetition gives them weight. Meeting together to make decisions changes how people imagine authority. Earlier generations of settlers depended almost entirely on instructions sent from distant investors across the ocean. And those instructions often arrived slowly, and sometimes no longer match conditions along the river by the time they were read. Local assemblies allowed colonists to respond more quickly to their own environment. Distance became smaller inside the room. Each representative carried the concerns of neighbors who could not travel easily to Jamestown themselves. Farmers living along distant bends of the river expected their voices to travel through these meetings, even if their feet remained at home. Over time, this expectation became familiar. Representation became routine. Outside the church, the settlement continues its ordinary work. Smoke rises from cooking fires. Boats shift gently along wooden docks. Children carry small bundles of kindling between shelters. Yet, inside the meeting space, something quieter is taking shape. Responsibility is being shared. The clerk finishes recording one decision and looks up as another discussion begins. Sunlight has shifted slightly across the floorboards, and dust moves through the air where it passes the open doorway. He dips the quill again and prepares to write the next line. Paper remembers what voices cannot keep forever. Not long after these early meetings began, the colony itself entered another stage of change. In the year 1624, Virginia became a royal colony under direct authority of the English crown rather than remaining entirely under company management. Even as this transition reshaped administration, the habit of local assembly did not disappear. It remained. People who had already learned to gather and decide together continued doing so. The structure of authority shifted above them. But their expectation of participation continued below. Habits travel farther than orders. Across the riverbanks and forest clearings surrounding Jamestown, settlers began to assume that local matters could be discussed locally. Questions about roads, planting boundaries, and community defense belonged not only to distant officials, but also to neighbors meeting face to face. The change was gradual. No single meeting created it. Yet each meeting strengthened it. Inside the church, the clerk finishes another line and gently lifts the page to dry the ink before closing the ledger. The room grows quieter as discussions settle into agreement. Outside, evening light begins to soften along the river. Boats drift slowly toward their moorings. Smoke thins above the settlement. Voices fade into smaller conversations. The assembly ends without ceremony. No bells announce its importance. No monuments mark the moment. And yet the habit formed inside this simple wooden building will continue long after the first benches are replaced and the first walls repaired. It will shape expectations about how communities organize themselves, how authority is questioned, and how cooperation grows across distance. Parliaments sometimes begin beside prayer benches. As darkness gathers gently over the river and the clerk carries his ledger toward the doorway, the settlement settles into its evening quiet once more. Fields wait for the next planting season. Boats wait for the next tide. Roads wait for the next travelers who will follow them inland. Across centuries and continents, survival has often depended not only on walls or crops or ships, but on systems people built together so gradually that they almost disappeared into daily routine. And in that quiet routine, the past continues keeping watch.